Dr. Maya Bennett is a physician whose brilliance speaks for itself: years of groundbreaking research, exceptional patient care, and a reputation as a mentor to young doctors. She is everything a leader should be: experienced, dedicated, and inspiring. But when the opportunity to become department chair at her prestigious hospital arises, Maya faces a bitter truth. Sometimes, hard work isn't enough. Despite her qualifications, Maya is quietly passed over. The reasons are vague: not quite the right fit. They say words that sting with the weight of unspoken bias. When a trusted colleague reveals the real reason behind her rejection, Maya is forced to confront a system that seems determined to overlook her. As Maya grapples with disappointment, she must decide whether to accept defeat or rise above it. Along the way, unexpected kindness and long-forgotten moments remind her of the impact she's had on others. With resilience as her guide, Maya begins to build something that no rejection can take away: a legacy that inspires those who follow. What happens when quiet strength meets systemic barriers? How does one redefine success in the face of rejection? And can one person truly create change from the ground up? Dr. Maya Bennett's day started like most others. At 6 a.m. sharp, her alarm buzzed in the small, tidy apartment she called home. Sunlight filtered through the curtains of her bedroom, casting golden lines across the walls. Her place was modest, but carefully kept framed photos of her late parents rested on the bookshelf. A few plants she tended to with care dotted the windowsill, and her desk overflowed with medical journals and research notes. It was the kind of home that whispered warmth and discipline, much like the woman who lived there. Maya sat at her dining table, sipping a black coffee, her eyes scanning the latest medical articles on her tablet. Even in her downtime, her mind rarely slowed. She was 45 now, years of hard work etched into the quiet strength of her features. Her dark brown skin glowed against the sunlight, and the small streaks of gray at her temples spoke not of age, but wisdom. To the outside world, Dr. Bennett was an image of poise, a woman who wore her success like an armor, with an unwavering dedication to her craft. Her phone buzzed. A message from Sarah Nolan, her close friend and colleague. "Big meeting at 8. Be there early. You'll want to hear this." Maya's brow furrowed slightly as she stood to grab her coat. Sarah's messages were rarely cryptic, her tone always upbeat and straightforward. Something about it tugged at Maya's thoughts as she grabbed her keys and headed out the door. The hospital was alive with the morning rush when Maya arrived. Nurses pushed carts through the hallways, doctors reviewed charts in corners, and patients shuffled through the waiting areas. The scent of antiseptic filled the air, a sharp but familiar smell that had become a constant in her life. Maya moved quickly through the halls, nodding to her team with her signature calm. She was respected here, and not just for her titles. Her quiet leadership inspired trust. When she stepped into a room, people listened. She didn't need to demand attention. Her actions spoke loudly enough. "Dr. Bennett," Sarah called out from the far end of the hall. A petite woman with sharp blue eyes and a perpetual air of urgency. Sarah caught up to her breathlessly. "The meeting's starting in 15. You've got a nomination." Maya froze mid-step, looking at Sarah in surprise. "A nomination?" Sarah grinned, clutching her clipboard. "For department chair. Everyone knows you're perfect for it. Come on, let's go." For a moment Maya couldn't speak. The idea of becoming department chair, leading the very unit she had helped build, was one she'd allowed herself to dream of, though she never voiced it aloud. She had worked tirelessly to elevate patient care, to push forward research that had saved countless lives. She had taken young residents under her wing, guiding them with the same patience her mentors once showed her. To lead the department would be the culmination of her life's work. As Maya entered the conference room, the air buzzed with chatter. The board members sat around a polished wooden table, their expressions neutral but observing. Sarah gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder before slipping into a seat. The meeting began. Dr. Lucas Ford, a senior doctor who had always supported her, stood and cleared his throat. "We're here to discuss the upcoming appointment for department chair. Several strong candidates have been put forward, but one, in particular, stands out." He looked directly at Maya. "Dr. Maya Bennett." The room quieted. Maya felt their eyes turn toward her. A mix of emotions churned in her chest: pride, nervousness, hope. She held herself steady, offering a small nod of acknowledgement. Dr. Ford continued, outlining her achievements. Years of groundbreaking research, her role in mentoring dozens of young physicians, and her reputation for patient care that was unmatched. Maya listened quietly, her fingers resting against her lap, but her thoughts spun. She thought of the years spent proving herself not just as a woman, not just as a doctor, but as a black doctor in a world where people like her were often overlooked. She thought of her late mother's voice saying, "You'll have to be twice as good, Maya. Never forget that." "Any discussion?" Ford's voice broke through her thoughts. There was a pause, followed by a few murmured exchanges. Maya glanced across the table, trying to read the faces of the board members. Most were cordial, but guarded. A few smiled faintly, though their eyes didn't match the sentiment. By the time the meeting ended, Maya felt like she had run a marathon without moving. Sarah caught up to her in the hallway, beaming. "They're impressed. You nailed it." Maya smiled softly. "It's not over yet. Let's see what happens." "You're being modest," Sarah replied, nudging her. "No one else comes close." Maya wished she could share Sarah's confidence, but a quiet voice at the back of her mind held her back. She had learned early in life not to celebrate too soon. Titles like department chair were symbols of trust, leadership, and prestige, and they came with expectations that often didn't look like her. Later that evening, Maya sat alone at her desk, sorting through charts. Outside her office window, the city skyline glowed softly in the dusk. She leaned back in her chair, exhaustion seeping into her bones, when a knock at the door startled her. "Come in." Dr. Lucas Ford entered, holding a small cup of tea. "Thought you could use a break," he said, setting the cup down on her desk. "Thank you." Maya smiled faintly, taking the cup and holding it between her palms. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," Lucas said. He took the seat across from her, his tone shifting. "You did well today, Maya. You deserve this." Her eyes met his. "We'll see." Lucas hesitated, as if carefully choosing his next words. "I know it hasn't been easy for you. The hurdles you've faced." He stopped himself. "I just want you to know that some of us see it. We see you." Maya blinked, his words catching her off guard. It wasn't often that someone acknowledged the unspoken struggles that had shaped her journey. "Thank you, Lucas. That means more than you know." He nodded, standing to leave. "Get some rest tonight. You've earned it." As Lucas left, Maya sat in the quiet, his words lingering in her mind. "We see you." She looked at the framed photograph of her parents on the shelf, her mother smiling softly, her father standing tall. She thought of the sacrifices they made to give her this life. A pang of longing hit her chest, but it was quickly replaced by a familiar resolve. She would keep showing up, keep working, because that was what she had always done. It was what her parents had taught her, to carry herself with dignity, no matter the challenges. At home, Maya sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the city lights through her window. The nomination, the recognition, it was everything she had worked for. Yet she couldn't silence the tiny voice inside her head asking, "What if it isn't enough?" Her mother's words came back to her again. "You'll have to be twice as good." She closed her eyes, letting the weight of the day settle over her. For now, there was nothing to do but wait. In the darkness, as the city hummed around her, Maya whispered softly to herself, "I am enough. I've always been enough." And with that, She pulled the blanket over her shoulders and allowed herself, for the first time in days, to rest. The morning sun slipped through the curtains of Maya Bennett's small apartment, yet the warmth didn't reach her today. She sat at her dining table again, staring at her untouched cup of black coffee. Her hands rested against her lap, her shoulders tense. Today was the day. She tried to distract herself by flipping through the charts she brought home, but the words blurred on the page. No matter how many times she told herself to stay calm, her mind betrayed her. The email announcing the decision for department chair was scheduled to arrive at 9 a.m. She glanced at the clock, 8:47. Each tick seemed impossibly loud in the quiet of her home. Her phone buzzed on the table, a message from Sarah. "Whatever happens, you're amazing. Call me after?" Maya smiled faintly, appreciating the words. Sarah had always been the kind of friend who spoke with unwavering belief, as though her sheer conviction could bend reality. Maya wished she could borrow some of it. By the time 9 a.m. struck, she had her email pulled up, her finger hovering over the refresh button. It felt ridiculous how much a single announcement could weigh. Yet, it wasn't just about a title. It was about validation, recognition that her years of work, her sacrifices, were worth it. She hit refresh, and there it was. Subject: Decision regarding department chair appointment. Her breath hitched. She clicked it open, scanning quickly. Dear Dr. Bennett, we want to thank you for your application and for your invaluable contributions to the hospital. After careful deliberation, we have chosen to proceed with another candidate. While your qualifications are truly impressive, we feel you may not be the best fit for this particular role at this time. Maya's chest tightened. The words, "not the best fit," echoed in her mind. She read the email twice, then 3 times, as if searching for a hidden explanation. No specifics, no reasoning. Just, not the best fit. The phone in her hand trembled slightly, though her expression remained composed. She exhaled, slow and deliberate, trying to keep her emotions contained. She had seen rejection before. She had faced it in medical school, in residency, in the early years of her career. Each time she had pushed forward. But this one felt different. This time, she wasn't a young doctor trying to prove herself. She had already proven herself. Her results, her accolades, every measure that should matter spoke for her. Yet somehow, it still wasn't enough. Her phone buzzed again, a call from Sarah. Maya hesitated before answering. "Hey." "Maya." Sarah's voice was cautious, careful. "I just saw the email." There was a pause. Maya swallowed hard. "Yeah, I did too." "I don't know what to say," Sarah said softly. "You deserve this." "It's fine." Maya's voice was even, though a part of her hated how practiced those words sounded. "Maybe they'll reconsider next year." Sarah sighed on the other end. "They gave it to Mark Rollins. Did you hear?" Maya froze. "Mark?" "Yes, Mark Rollins, a doctor she had worked alongside for years, a man who was undoubtedly capable, but with far less experience than her. He hadn't led as many research projects, hadn't mentored as many residents. Maya had even coached him through his first major publication years ago. The realization settled in her stomach like a stone. "They're saying he has a fresh perspective," Sarah said, bitterness creeping into her voice. "But we both know what this is." Maya closed her eyes, steadying herself. "Sarah? No, Maya, it's not fair. You're twice as qualified. They just don't see it." That word again. "See?" Maya forced a small smile, though Sarah couldn't see it. "It's fine, really. Thank you for telling me." "Maya, I'm fine," she repeated, firmer this time. "I'll see you at rounds." She ended the call before Sarah could argue. Her hands were steady now, her face composed, but her mind churned. Not the right fit. Not the image they want? The thought clawed at her, a familiar but unwelcome feeling. She had been here before. By the time Maya reached the hospital, she had tucked the rejection away, hidden it beneath her usual professional calm. She walked briskly through the halls, her white coat crisp, her stethoscope looped neatly around her neck. Nurses greeted her with smiles, and residents fell into step beside her, asking for advice on cases. If anyone noticed anything different about her today, no one said so. That was how Maya operated: quiet strength, steady hands, always in control. Dr. Bennett? Maya turned to see Sierra Harris, the young black resident she had been mentoring for the past year. Sierra's face lit up when she approached. I was hoping I'd catch you. Do you have time to look over my latest case notes? Of course, Maya said with a small nod. They walked side by side toward the conference room. Sierra chatted eagerly, describing her case: a patient with a rare autoimmune condition. Maya listened carefully, offering thoughtful feedback and encouragement. I don't know what I'd do without you, Sierra admitted with a laugh as they sat down at the table. Sometimes I feel like I'm in way over my head. You're doing well, Maya assured her. I felt the same way when I was a resident. But you'll get there. Just trust your instincts. Sierra's expression softened, and she looked at Maya thoughtfully. You know, Dr. Bennett, it's people like you who give people like me hope. Maya blinked, caught off guard. What do you mean? Sierra smiled. Seeing you, someone who looks like me, someone who's made it so far, it makes me believe I can do it too, even when it's hard. You have no idea how much that means. The words hit Maya harder than she expected. For a moment, she couldn't respond. She thought of her mother again, the sacrifices she made, the quiet encouragement she gave Maya every step of the way. You'll have to be twice as good. And now, here was Sierra, someone looking to Maya, the way she once looked to her own mentors. The realization stung and soothed all at once. Thank you, Sierra, Maya said quietly. That means a lot. Sierra's face brightened, as though she didn't realize the weight of what she had given. That evening, as Maya packed up to leave, she heard a knock at her office door. She looked up to see Mr. Curtis, the janitor, leaning in with a warm smile. Dr. Bennett, you're here late again. Maya smiled faintly. Just finishing up. Mr. Curtis stepped inside, holding a steaming cup of tea. I made this for you. Figured you could use it. She blinked, surprised. You didn't have to do that. Of course I did, he said kindly. You're always looking out for everyone else. Someone's got to look out for you. Maya took the cup, a small but genuine smile tugging at her lips. Thank you, Mr. Curtis. He nodded, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. You have a good night, Dr. Bennett. Don't let this place wear you down too much. As he left, Maya sat alone with the cup in her hands, feeling its warmth seep into her palms. The small act of kindness, unexpected and genuine, settled in her chest like a balm. For a moment, she allowed herself to sit in the quiet, feeling the weight of the day. It wasn't fair. None of it was, but Sierra's words echoed in her mind. You give people like me hope. Maybe, Maya thought, that was what mattered most. She took a slow sip of tea and whispered softly to herself, keep going. The following day, Maya arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. The long halls were quiet, illuminated only by the faint glow of fluorescent lights. She liked it this way before the day's noise began, before her presence required its usual armor. As she walked to her office, she clutched a steaming coffee in one hand and her tablet in the other. She'd spent most of the night awake, replaying yesterday's rejection, the words, not the best fit, circling her thoughts like an unwanted refrain. Her phone buzzed just as she unlocked her office door. A message from Dr. Lucas Ford. Can you swing by my office later this morning? We need to talk. Maya frowned as she set her things down. Lucas wasn't one for cryptic messages. We need to talk. Nothing good ever came from words like that. But before she could dwell on it, her mind shifted back to the day ahead. Patients, residents, rounds. The hospital didn't slow for anyone, not even for disappointment. By mid-morning, Maya was already halfway through her rounds. She moved with her usual efficiency, answering questions and checking in on patients. Her residents walked briskly beside her, pens poised to jot down her every word. At one point, Sierra fell into step beside her, looking eager. "Dr. Bennett, I wanted to thank you again for yesterday," Sierra said, her voice low so as not to disturb others. "You've really helped me build my confidence." Maya offered a small smile, though something about the word stung. Confidence. It was something she had spent years building herself layer by layer, rejection by rejection. "Confidence will carry you far," Maya replied softly. "But always remember your work speaks for itself. Let it shine." Sierra nodded, her expression hopeful. Maya envied that hopefulness, the belief that hard work alone would always prevail. By the time Maya reached Lucas Ford's office later that morning, the halls had come alive with noise and movement. She knocked once on the open door, catching Lucas mid-sip of his tea. He waved her in. "Morning, Maya," he said, offering her a seat across from his cluttered desk. Papers were stacked in uneven towers. Medical books sprawled open in a chaotic circle. "Thanks for coming by." "Of course," Maya replied, sitting down and setting her tablet on her lap. "What's this about?" Lucas leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. "I wanted to talk about the department chair decision." Maya stiffened slightly, but forced herself to remain neutral. "I figured as much." Lucas sighed, setting his tea down on a pile of papers. "I'm just going to say it, Maya. You should have gotten that position. Everyone knows it." Maya's chest tightened. The words felt both validating and frustrating. "Then why didn't I?" Lucas hesitated, glancing toward the window before looking back at her. "Off the record?" "Off the record," Maya said, her voice steady. "They think you don't fit the image they're looking for." The words landed like a punch, even though she had suspected as much. Still, hearing them out loud, so plainly stated, made it hard to breathe. "What image is that, exactly?" she asked quietly. Lucas shifted uncomfortably, his voice low. "You know how it is, Maya. People like Mark Young, white, charismatic, they make people comfortable. They look like what the board expects leadership to be. It's not fair. I know that. But that's what they're saying in private." For a long moment, Maya said nothing. Her mind buzzed with emotion, anger, frustration, exhaustion. She had heard these unspoken rules before, but hearing them spoken aloud felt like pulling back a curtain on something she wasn't meant to see. Finally, she asked, "And what did you say?" Lucas looked pained. "I spoke up for you. I pushed as hard as I could." He leaned forward, his voice gentle. "Maya, I know this hurt, but don't let it stop you. You're too good to let their ignorance win." Maya nodded faintly, though her thoughts were elsewhere. She knew Lucas meant well. He was one of the few colleagues who had always supported her, and yet his words didn't ease the sting. They only reinforced a truth she had been trying to ignore. No matter how hard she worked, some barriers remained invisible, but unyielding. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Maya performed her duties as usual, but the words from Lucas haunted her. "You don't fit the image." Late in the afternoon, she sat alone in the break room, a cup of tea cooling in front of her. The space was quiet now, the hum of a nearby vending machine the only sound. She rested her elbows on the table, her chin in her hands, replaying the morning's conversation. Her mind wandered back to the beginning of her career. She remembered standing in her first hospital hallway, a fresh medical degree in hand, full of ambition and purpose. Back then, she had believed that hard work and results were all that mattered. Now, after years of fighting to be seen, the cracks in that belief felt larger than ever. The door to the break room creaked open, and Maya looked up to see Mr. Curtis, the janitor, stepping inside with a mop. He froze when he saw her, his face lighting up in surprise. "Dr. Bennett, I didn't think anyone was in here." Maya offered a small smile. Just grabbing a break. Mr. Curtis nodded, leaning on his mop for a moment. He was an older man, likely in his late 60s, with salt and pepper hair and kind, deep-set eyes. "You look tired, Doc. Long day?" "Something like that," Maya replied softly. He studied her for a beat before shaking his head with a small chuckle. "You know, I've been working in this hospital for nearly 30 years. I've seen doctors come and go, good and bad. But you, Dr. Bennett, you're the real deal. You know that?" Maya blinked, caught off guard. "Thank you, Mr. Curtis." He waved a hand, as if brushing off her thanks. "No, I mean it. You care about people, your patients, your team. You don't see that kind of thing often. And let me tell you, it doesn't go unnoticed. Not by folks like me." Maya stared at him for a long moment, his words settling into her chest. "Don't let them tell you otherwise," he added firmly, as though reading her mind. "People like you change places like this, whether they know it yet or not." Before Maya could respond, Mr. Curtis nodded once and returned to his work, humming softly as he mopped the floor. Maya sat back in her chair, her tea now cold, feeling an unexpected warmth in her chest. The words were simple, but they hit deeper than she expected. "You're the real deal." People like Mr. Curtis saw her. Sierra saw her. Her patients saw her. Even when the people in power failed to, there were still those who believed in her. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep going. That evening, as Maya walked to her car in the darkened hospital parking lot, she felt lighter. The rejection still stung, and the fight still felt uphill, but something had shifted in her. The system might not change overnight. It might not change in her lifetime. But as she thought of Sierra, of the residents she mentored, of the quiet acknowledgement from people like Mr. Curtis, she realized her impact was already larger than a title. She stopped at her car and looked up at the sky, the stars faint but present. "People like you change places like this," Mr. Curtis's words echoed again. She whispered softly to herself, "Keep going." And she would. The next day, Maya arrived at the hospital with her shoulders squared and her chin lifted, as though wearing an invisible armor. The sting of rejection still lingered beneath her calm exterior, but Mr. Curtis's words and Sierra's gratitude remained like steady hands on her back, keeping her upright. "People like you change places like this." As Maya strode through the corridors, the hospital hummed with its usual energy. Residents hustled between patient rooms, nurses called out updates, and monitors beeped softly in the background. Yet to Maya, there was a subtle change in how she viewed her surroundings. For years, she had focused solely on the work on saving lives, mentoring residents, advancing research. She had convinced herself that doing those things well would be enough. But yesterday's conversation with Lucas had left a bitter aftertaste. "You don't fit the image." Those 5 words seemed to follow her now, like a shadow she couldn't outrun. At midday, as Maya flipped through patient charts at the nurse's station, she felt a presence beside her. Looking up, she saw Dr. Mark Rollins, the newly appointed department chair. "Morning, Dr. Bennett," Mark said, his smile polite but distant. "Morning," Maya replied, keeping her tone professional. Mark shifted his weight awkwardly, holding a folder in his hands. "Listen, I just wanted to say, I hope there are no hard feelings." Maya paused, her fingers freezing mid-turn on a page. Slowly, she looked up at him, searching his expression. Mark was young mid-30s with a clean-cut look and an air of earnest confidence. He meant well, she thought, but his words still landed like a slap. "No hard feelings?" Maya repeated carefully, her voice calm. Mark flushed slightly. "I mean, I know you were in the running too. You've done amazing work here. I wanted to say that I respect you, Dr. Bennett. I really do." Maya studied him for a moment, trying to decide if he realized how empty his words sounded. "Thank you, Mark," she replied evenly. "Congratulations on your appointment. I'm sure you'll do well." Mark looked relieved, as though he'd been afraid of confrontation. "Thanks. That means a lot coming from you." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Maya to stare at the folder he'd left on the counter. She picked it up absent-mindedly, her hands tightening around the edges as her thoughts raced. "I hope there are no hard feelings." The phrase echoed in her mind. Mark had been given the position, handed a title she had earned twice over, and yet she was the one expected to smooth things over, to make others comfortable. The familiar frustration simmered beneath her calm surface. Later that afternoon, Maya sat alone in her office, her lunch sitting untouched beside her. The day had worn her down more than she cared to admit. She opened her laptop, intending to catch up on notes, when there was a knock at her door. "Come in," she called. Lucas stepped inside, a somber expression on his face. He glanced at the untouched lunch and shook his head. "You know you need to eat, right?" Maya allowed a faint smile. "I'll get to it." Lucas shut the door behind him and sat across from her desk. "I wanted to follow up on our conversation yesterday," he said, his voice low. "You deserve to know what's really happening behind closed doors." Maya set her pen down and leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Go on." Lucas hesitated, as though choosing his words carefully. "The board, some of them think having you in a leadership role might make people uncomfortable." "Uncomfortable," Maya repeated, her voice tight. Lucas nodded. "You know what they mean, Maya. They won't say it out loud, but I will. It's not about your work, it's about what you represent. A black woman in charge? It challenges the picture they've held on to for too long. They see it as risky." Maya stared at him, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had always known the barriers existed, but hearing them so plainly made it impossible to pretend otherwise. Lucas leaned forward, his voice softer now. "I'm telling you this because you deserve better. I don't want you thinking it's about your qualifications. It's not. It's about their ignorance." For a long moment, Maya didn't respond. She felt the weight of his words pressing down on her, wrapping around her like a heavy blanket. Finally, she said quietly, "Thank you for telling me." Lucas sat back, his expression filled with regret. "I wish I could do more. But I want you to know, some of us see you, really see you, and we're with you." Maya nodded faintly, though her mind was elsewhere. "I appreciate it, Lucas. I do." He stood, giving her a firm nod. "Don't give up, Maya. This place needs you more than it knows." After he left, Maya sat still, staring at her desk. "They think it's risky." Her thoughts churned with frustration and anger. She had worked so hard to become someone the hospital couldn't ignore, yet here she was, facing the same old barriers, repackaged in new words. The clock on the wall ticked softly, counting down the minutes as she sat in silence. That evening, Maya stayed late at the hospital. Her office lights cast a warm glow into the otherwise darkened hallways. She was reviewing patient cases when she heard a faint knock at her door. "Dr. Bennett?" Looking up, she saw Sierra peeking in, holding a stack of papers in her arms. Her expression was hesitant. "Come in, Sierra," Maya said, forcing a small smile. Sierra stepped inside, clutching the papers nervously. "Sorry to bother you so late. I just, wanted to ask for your thoughts on something." Maya gestured to the chair across from her. "Take a seat. What's on your mind?" Sierra sat down, fumbling with the papers in her hands. "It's about leadership, actually. I've been thinking a lot about what it means to belong in places like this." Maya tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean?" Sierra's voice was quiet but steady. "When I see what you've done, everything you've accomplished, I think about how hard you must have worked to get here. But then I wonder, do you ever feel like no matter what you do, it's never enough?" Maya's breath caught. Sierra's words were raw, honest, and painfully familiar. "Sometimes," she admitted softly, "but you can't let that stop you." Sierra nodded, looking down at the papers. I guess what I'm trying to say is, you make me believe it's worth it, that we do belong here, even if they don't see it yet. Maya felt her throat tighten. She looked at Sierra young, determined, full of hope, and saw herself reflected back. "Thank you, Sierra," Maya said quietly. "That means more than you know." Sierra smiled faintly, her shoulders relaxing. "We're lucky to have you, Dr. Bennett." After Sierra left, Maya sat alone in the quiet office. The words Lucas had shared earlier still stung, but Sierra's small declaration lingered longer. "You make me believe it's worth it." For all the doors that refused to open for her, Maya realized she had already been holding them open for others. Maybe that was the real victory, the lives she was changing, the hope she was inspiring, and as long as she could keep doing that, she wouldn't stop. As Maya packed her bag to leave, she glanced back at her office one last time. The rejection hadn't disappeared, and the fight wasn't over. But for tonight, she felt a quiet resolve settle in her chest. Walking through the empty hallways, she whispered to herself once more, "Keep going." And she would. The hospital corridors were unusually quiet as Maya made her way toward the elevators. It was still early, before the usual rush, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights filled the space. She stepped inside the empty elevator and pressed the button for her floor. As the doors closed, Maya let her shoulders sag, if only for a moment. She hadn't slept much the night before. Lucas's words, "They think it's risky," still gnawed at her, carving a hollow space inside her chest. She thought of Mark's awkward apology, his empty attempt to smooth over his own ascent. It wasn't fair. But fairness, Maya had learned long ago, was not guaranteed, not for people like her. The elevator doors slid open, and Maya quickly reset her expression, calm, focused, unshakable. She was good at this, folding her doubts away like unwanted laundry, tucking them where no one could see. "Morning, Dr. Bennett." The cheerful voice of Sierra Harris caught her attention as she stepped into the hallway. The young resident beamed at her, holding her tablet close to her chest. Sierra's optimism felt like sunlight, and for a brief moment, Maya allowed herself to smile. "Morning, Sierra," she said, her tone warm but professional. "How's that patient with lupus doing?" Sierra fell into step beside her, launching into a detailed update on her case. Maya listened carefully, offering feedback where needed, but part of her mind remained distracted. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, like a crack had formed in the armor she'd spent years building. They reached the nurse's station, where Maya paused to review patient charts. Sierra lingered nearby, clearly hesitant. "Dr. Bennett?" she finally asked, her voice low. Maya glanced up, arching an eyebrow. "Yes?" Sierra bit her lip, as though searching for the right words. "Can I ask you something personal?" Maya set the chart down, giving the young doctor her full attention. "Go ahead." "How do you keep going?" Sierra asked softly. "When you know they don't always see you or value you?" The question was like a blow to the chest, unexpected and deeply felt. For a moment, Maya said nothing. She stared at Sierra, seeing the unspoken fears in her young eyes. The same fears Maya had carried when she was Sierra's age, fears she still carried now. Finally, Maya spoke, her voice steady. "Because I don't let them define me. I focus on the work, the patients, the research, the people I can help. That's what matters." Sierra nodded, looking both reassured and uncertain. "Do you ever doubt it?" Maya hesitated. "Sometimes," she admitted quietly. "But when I see someone like you stepping up, working hard, pushing forward, I'm reminded that it's worth it, that we're worth it." Sierra's expression softened, and she smiled faintly. "Thank you, Dr. Bennett. You always know what to say." Maya returned the smile, though a familiar ache settled in her chest. She wished she truly believed her own words. That afternoon, Maya sat in her office, surrounded by the quiet hum of her computer and the low buzz of her desk lamp. She was charting notes when her phone buzzed. It was a call from her sister, Jasmine. Maya hesitated before answering. "Hey, Jazz." "Hey, Maya." Jasmine's familiar voice chirped through the line. "Just checking in. How's work?" Maya leaned back in her chair, staring at the framed photo of her parents on the bookshelf. "Busy, as always. What about you? How's the family?" Jasmine went on about her 2 kids, her husband, and the chaos of balancing it all. Maya listened, grateful for the distraction. Her sister's life was so different from hers, warm, chaotic, full of noise. In contrast, Maya's world felt quieter, lonelier. "Maya," Jasmine said, her tone shifting, "I heard about the department chair decision. I'm so sorry." Maya's stomach clenched. "Who told you?" "Someone from the hospital. Word travels fast." Jasmine paused, as if choosing her next words carefully. "I know how hard you worked for this. You deserve that position, Maya. Everyone knows it." "It's fine, Jazz," Maya replied, though her voice was thin. "These things happen." "They shouldn't happen," Jasmine said firmly. "You're the best person for that role, and they know it. I don't understand." "Jazz," Maya cut her off gently. "It's okay." There was a long pause. "No, it's not okay," Jasmine said softly. "You've worked so hard, Maya. You've sacrificed so much, and you keep hitting these walls. Doesn't it wear you down?" Maya stared at the ceiling, her throat tight. "Sometimes," she admitted. Jasmine sighed. "You know, Mom would be so proud of you. Even if they don't see it, she would." Maya closed her eyes, feeling the tears threaten. Mom would be so proud. "Thanks, Jazz," she said quietly. "I needed to hear that." "Any time," Jasmine replied, her voice softening. "And Maya, don't give up. You've come too far to stop now." After they hung up, Maya sat in the quiet of her office, Jasmine's words ringing in her ears. "Doesn't it wear you down?" The truth was, it did. She was tired of pushing, of proving, of fighting to be seen. For all her success, for all her hard work, there were moments when the weight of it all felt unbearable. She turned to the photo of her parents, her mother's soft smile and her father's proud stance frozen in time. She thought of their sacrifices, her mother working double shifts to put food on the table, her father pushing her to aim higher when the world tried to pull her down. "You would be proud, wouldn't you?" Maya whispered to the photo, and somehow that thought kept her going. As evening fell, Maya made her way through the dimly lit hospital corridors, her footsteps echoing softly. She had decided to check in on a patient before leaving a teenage girl recovering from surgery. When she entered the room, the girl's mother looked up in surprise. "Dr. Bennett," she said, standing quickly. "Thank you for coming." Maya smiled warmly. "How's she doing?" "She's resting," the mother replied, glancing toward her daughter. "I just wanted to thank you for everything you've done. You saved her life." Maya's heart softened. "It's my job. I'm glad she's doing well." "No, it's more than that," the mother said firmly. "You don't just treat patients, Dr. Bennett. You care. You don't know how much that means to families like ours." Maya felt a lump in her throat. "Thank you," she said softly. As she left the room, she paused for a moment in the hallway, letting the mother's words settle. "You don't just treat patients, you care." It was a small moment, a quiet kindness, but it reminded Maya of why she kept going. Titles and promotions might have eluded her, but her work mattered. She mattered. And as long as she was here, she would keep pushing forward no matter how heavy the weight became. Walking toward the exit, Maya whispered to herself once more, "Keep going." And she knew she would. The morning sun had barely risen when Maya found herself back at the hospital. She sat in the parking lot, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at the building she had come to know better than her own home. Normally, she'd step out of her car without hesitation, ready to tackle the day's work. But today, she hesitated. The weight of everything, the rejection, Lucas's confirmation of the bias, Jasmine's words about sacrifice, sat heavy on her chest. The doubts she had spent years pushing down now gnawed at her resolve. "Doesn't it wear you down?" Jasmine had asked. It did, more than she was willing to admit. She closed her eyes, leaning her forehead against the wheel, whispering to herself, "Just one day at a time." Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and made her way inside. The day began with rounds, and Maya moved through the motions as though on autopilot. Her residents followed her closely, scribbling down notes as she led them from room to room, offering guidance and feedback. She was as composed and efficient as ever, but something in her felt frayed. By mid-morning, Maya was reviewing patient cases at the nurses' station when she overheard two younger doctors whispering nearby. "Did you hear about Dr. Rollins's appointment?" one of them said. "Yeah. Honestly, I thought Dr. Bennett was a shoo-in," the other replied. "But you know, politics." Their words cut through Maya like glass. She stiffened, her pen hovering over the notes she was writing. The first doctor muttered quietly, "Still, it's probably easier for everyone this way. Rollins fits the bill, you know. Less complicated." "Right," the second one said before they walked off. Maya stood still, the words, "less complicated," echoing in her mind. It wasn't the first time she had heard things like this word spoken softly enough to avoid confrontation, but loud enough to sting. The unspoken message was clear. Leadership was easier to accept when it came in a familiar package. Her chest tightened. For a moment, the composure she always wore felt fragile, like glass on the verge of shattering. "Maya?" She turned to see Sarah approaching, her expression concerned. "You okay?" Maya forced a tight smile. "Fine. Just a long morning." Sarah studied her for a moment, unconvinced. "Want to grab lunch? My treat." "I'll pass," Maya replied, her voice clipped. "I have too much to do." Before Sarah could protest, Maya turned and walked briskly down the hall, away from the nurses' station, away from the whispers. Maya's office felt like a sanctuary when she finally shut the door behind her. She sank into her chair, her breath shallow. She wanted to scream, to hit something, to release the frustration that had been building inside her for days, weeks, years. Instead, she stared at the wall, her hands trembling faintly in her lap. She thought of Lucas's words, "It's not about your qualifications." She thought of Mark's awkward apology. She thought of the whispers, "less complicated." A knock at the door startled her. "Not now," Maya called, her voice sharper than she intended. The door cracked open anyway, and Sierra stepped inside, holding a file against her chest. Her face fell when she saw Maya's expression. I'm sorry, Dr. Bennett. I didn't mean to interrupt." Maya immediately softened. "It's okay, Sierra. Come in." Sierra hesitated but took a few cautious steps forward. I wanted to run something by you. But it can wait." Maya gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit down. What's going on?" Sierra sat, fiddling with the corner of the file. "It's about my patient, the one with lupus. I've been second-guessing my treatment plan. I know I ran it by you already, but—" She trailed off, biting her lip. Maya studied her for a moment, seeing the doubt written plainly on Sierra's face. It reminded her of herself as a young resident, always second-guessing, always terrified of making a mistake. "Tell me what's on your mind," Maya said gently. Sierra took a breath and began explaining her concerns. Maya listened carefully, her focus shifting from her own struggles to Sierra's words. She offered thoughtful suggestions, guiding Sierra back toward confidence in her decisions. "Trust yourself," Maya said softly when Sierra finished. "You've got good instincts. Follow them." Sierra nodded, her face brightening slightly. Thank you, Dr. Bennett. I don't know what I'd do without you. Maya managed a small smile. You'll be fine, Sierra. You're going to be a great doctor. As Sierra left, Maya sat back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Despite everything she was feeling, helping Sierra had steadied her, if only for a moment. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but Maya couldn't shake the weight pressing down on her. By the time the evening sun dipped below the horizon, she felt drained. She left her office, her bag slung over her shoulder, and made her way down the quiet hallways toward the exit. As she turned a corner, she nearly bumped into Mr. Curtis, who was mopping the floor. He looked up, his face breaking into a warm smile. "Dr. Bennett, you're still here?" Maya sighed faintly. "Heading out now, Mr. Curtis." He leaned on his mop, studying her. "You look tired, Doc." "It's been a long day." Mr. Curtis nodded, as though he understood more than she was saying. "You know, I saw you with that young doctor earlier. The one you've been mentoring. You're doing good work here, Dr. Bennett." Maya managed a small smile. "Thank you." He tilted his head, his voice gentle. "Don't let him get to you." Maya blinked, surprised. "What do you mean?" Mr. Curtis shrugged. "I've been around this hospital a long time. Seen people like you come and go, folks who work twice as hard but still get pushed aside." He shook his head. "It ain't right. But you've got something special, Dr. Bennett. People like you don't just do the work. You change the place." Maya's throat tightened. "Sometimes it doesn't feel that way." Mr. Curtis smiled, his eyes kind. "Oh, but it is. You may not see it yet, but others do. That young doctor, she sees it. The patients you've saved, they see it. And me? I see it too." Maya felt her chest swell with emotion, the words settling deep inside her. For so long, she had been carrying the weight alone, convinced that no one noticed her struggles. Yet here was Mr. Curtis, a janitor who most people overlooked, offering her the very thing she needed most: acknowledgement. "You're not invisible, Dr. Bennett," he said softly. "Don't let him make you feel like you are." Maya swallowed hard, her voice quiet. "Thank you, Mr. Curtis." He nodded, picking up his mop again. "Get some rest, Doc. Tomorrow's a new day." As Maya walked out into the cool evening air, she felt something shift inside her. The doubt hadn't disappeared, and the fight wasn't over, but Mr. Curtis's words had given her something she hadn't felt in days: hope. That night, as she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, Maya reflected on the day. She thought of Sierra, of Mr. Curtis, of the countless people she had helped over the years. You're not invisible. Maybe she didn't need a title to prove her worth. Maybe the work she did, the lives she touched, was the greatest legacy she could leave behind. For the first time in days, Maya allowed herself to exhale. The weight wasn't gone, but it felt a little lighter now. She sipped her tea, staring out at the city lights beyond her window. And as the night deepened, she whispered softly to herself, "Keep going." And she would. The early morning light spilled through Maya's curtains, but today it carried a sense of calm she hadn't felt in weeks. For once, she didn't rush to get out of bed. She lay there quietly, staring at the ceiling, replaying Mr. Curtis's words from the night before. "You're not invisible." Those words had stayed with her, settling deep into the cracks of her doubts. It wasn't a grand speech or an earth-shattering moment, but sometimes the quiet truths had the most power. People like Sierra, her patients, Mr. Curtis, they saw her. And wasn't that why she'd chosen this path in the first place? By the time Maya reached the hospital, a hint of her usual steadiness had returned. She greeted her team warmly as she moved through the halls, checking on patients and reviewing charts. The rhythm of the work grounded her, but the sting of rejection still lingered beneath the surface, like a bruise not yet healed. In the afternoon, as she returned to her office between rounds, Maya found a stack of mail waiting for her on her desk. Most of it was mundane interdepartmental memos, research updates, a new issue of the New England Journal of Medicine. But at the bottom of the pile was a plain white envelope with her name handwritten neatly across the front. The script was unfamiliar. Curious, Maya set the other mail aside and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds. She smoothed it out and began to read. Dear Dr. Bennett, you may not remember me, but I will never forget you. Maya's brow furrowed slightly as she continued reading. 10 years ago, I was a patient on your floor, a scared young woman with a diagnosis I didn't understand, and no family by my side. I didn't know how I was going to make it, but then you walked into my room. You sat with me, explained my illness in words I could understand, and told me that I wasn't alone. You stayed after your rounds just to make sure I was okay. You made me feel seen when I felt invisible. The words blurred slightly as Maya blinked, her throat tightening. Today, I'm healthy. I'm married, and I'm a mother to a little girl who has her mother's strength because of you. I work in patient advocacy now because you showed me what compassion in medicine looks like. I've thought about writing this letter for years, and I'm sorry it took me so long, but I wanted you to know that your work mattered, that you mattered. With eternal gratitude, Catherine Reynolds. Maya sat back in her chair, the letter trembling slightly in her hands. She searched her memory, piecing together fragments of the past. Catherine Reynolds. She remembered the name now, just a young woman at the time, terrified and alone, her fear so palpable that Maya had spent an extra hour by her bedside that night, explaining her condition and holding her hand. She had almost forgotten. To Maya, it had been one moment in a sea of countless patients and long shifts, but to Catherine, it had meant everything. Maya reread the letter twice more, letting the words soak in. You made me feel seen when I felt invisible. Her eyes burned as she folded the letter carefully, placing it back in the envelope. She held it in her hands for a long moment, staring at it as though it were a lifeline. That evening, Maya walked through the hospital with a renewed sense of purpose. For so long, she had measured her worth by titles and validation, by recognition from those who sat at the top. But this letter reminded her of something she'd always known, but often forgotten. Her true impact wasn't in the boardrooms. It was in the lives she touched. As she passed the nurse's station, she spotted Sierra sitting at the desk, scribbling furiously in her notes. Maya paused, watching the young resident with quiet affection. Sierra reminded her so much of herself, eager, determined, and full of promise. Maya approached, her steps soft. Sierra. Sierra looked up quickly, her face lighting up. Oh, Dr. Bennett. Sorry, I didn't see you there. Maya smiled faintly. How's your patient doing? Stable for now, Sierra replied. I'm just double-checking the treatment plan. Maya studied her for a moment before sitting down in the chair next to her. You know, she began softly, when I was a resident, I had a mentor who once told me that leadership isn't about power or titles. It's about leaving people better than you found them. Sierra looked at her curiously. What do you mean? I mean, Maya continued, that leadership doesn't always come from the top. It comes from the way you show up, day after day, for your patients, for your team, for the people who depend on you. It comes from the quiet moments that no one else sees, but that change someone's life. Sierra's expression softened, and she nodded slowly. Like you do? Maya smiled. I try. Sierra hesitated, then spoke softly. Dr. Bennett, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you ever feel like it's not worth it? Like the system will never change, no matter what we do? Maya considered the question carefully. Sometimes, she admitted. But then I get reminders, small ones, that the work we do matters. Even when it feels like no one's watching, someone always is. Sierra looked down at her notes, processing the words. I hope I can be like that one day. You already are, Maya said gently. You're already making a difference. Sierra smiled, her shoulders relaxing. Thank you, Dr. Bennett. I don't know where I'd be without you. Maya's chest tightened, the sincerity in Sierra's voice touching her deeply. You're going to do great things, Sierra, she said softly. Never forget that. When Maya finally left the hospital that night, she carried Catherine's letter in her bag, close to her heart. The sky was dark, the city lights twinkling against the inky backdrop. She paused for a moment in the parking lot, looking up at the vastness of the night sky. The rejection, the bias, the whispers of being not the right fit. Those things still hurt. But tonight, they felt smaller somehow, less suffocating. For every door that refused to open, there was a patient like Catherine. For every boardroom that overlooked her, there was a resident like Sierra. Maya reached into her bag and pulled out Catherine's letter, reading the final line one more time. Your work mattered. You mattered. She whispered the words softly to herself, feeling their truth settle deep into her bones. And as she stood there beneath the quiet night sky, Maya allowed herself to believe it. Her impact wasn't defined by titles or the approval of others. It was defined by the lives she touched, the hope she gave, and the change she inspired, even if it came one small moment at a time. With that thought, Maya got into her car and drove home, a quiet peace filling the space where doubt had once lived. Tomorrow, she would return to the hospital. Tomorrow, she would keep going, because she mattered, and that was enough. Maya arrived at the hospital the next morning with an unfamiliar lightness in her steps. Catherine's letter was tucked safely into her bag, and though it wasn't visible, she felt its weight as a reminder, a reassurance. The words, "Your work mattered, you mattered," were etched into her thoughts, each syllable a quiet anchor against the doubts that had weighed her down for so long. For the first time in weeks, she walked through the hospital without feeling invisible. She saw the people who had always been there, nurses nodding at her with respect, residents who followed her guidance eagerly, patients who smiled when she entered their rooms. The board might not see her, but they did. Her first stop was the conference room, where she had scheduled an informal workshop for the residents. It was a mentorship initiative she had started years ago, something no one had asked her to do, but something she knew was necessary. The young doctors in the room were her focus now, her legacy taking root. "Good morning, everyone," Maya said as she stepped to the front of the room. The group of residents, diverse, eager, and tired in that way only medical professionals understood, looked up at her, notebooks open and ready. "I wanted to take a few minutes before we begin today's workshop to say something," Maya began, her voice calm and steady. She could see Sierra sitting in the front row, her pen poised, listening carefully. "This job is hard," Maya said, meeting their eyes. "You will doubt yourselves. You will face moments where it feels like your hard work doesn't matter, like you don't belong in this space." A few heads nodded subtly. Maya saw a young resident in the back, an Asian woman with dark circles under her eyes, exhale, as though the words had cracked something open. "When I started, I thought my work alone would speak for me," Maya continued. "I thought results were enough. But the truth is, sometimes the world will demand more of you. Sometimes people will look at you and see someone who doesn't fit their idea of what leadership or excellence looks like." The room was silent now. They were listening, really listening. "I'm telling you this not to discourage you, but to prepare you," Maya said firmly. "Because what you do next, how you respond to those moments, that's what defines you. Not their doubts, not their limits." She paused, letting the words settle. "When you feel unseen, remember this. Someone is always watching. A patient, a colleague, someone younger than you who needs to believe this path is possible. You may never know the impact you've had, but it's there." Sierra smiled faintly, and Maya returned it, warmth flickering in her chest. So, don't give up, Maya finished softly. This work matters. You matter. The residents clapped, not out of obligation, but because they meant it. Maya felt the sound settle into her bones. It wasn't a grand speech or a rallying cry, but it was honest, and she knew they needed to hear it. After the workshop ended, Sierra stayed behind, gathering her notes. Maya waited for her by the doorway. "Good job today, Sierra." "Thank you," Sierra said, looking up with a thoughtful expression. "That talk, it really meant a lot. I think we all needed to hear that." Maya smiled faintly. "I needed to say it." Sierra hesitated. "Do you ever feel like you're carrying all of this alone?" Maya considered the question carefully. "I used to, but I've realized recently that I'm not. There are always people who see you, people who believe in you. You just have to look for them." Sierra nodded slowly, her face softening. "Like you do for us." Maya felt a lump rise in her throat, but she smiled through it. "That's the goal." Later that afternoon, Maya found herself in an unexpected meeting with Dr. Lucas Ford and a small group of senior colleagues. She had been called in without much explanation, but as soon as she stepped into the room, she could sense the tension. "Maya, take a seat," Lucas said, his tone professional but encouraging. She settled into the chair, glancing around the table at the familiar faces. "Dr. Bennett," one of the other senior doctors began, adjusting his glasses, "we've been talking about some initiatives to improve mentorship and diversity within our leadership programs." Maya blinked, surprised. "Oh?" Lucas cleared his throat and spoke up. "Your work mentoring residents hasn't gone unnoticed, Maya. The board may not have appointed your department chair, but some of us believe change starts from the ground up. We want to formalize a mentorship and leadership pipeline, and we think you're the best person to lead it." For a moment, Maya didn't respond. The words hung in the air, sinking in slowly. She started, then stopped, carefully choosing her words. "I appreciate that, but if this is about appeasing me for not getting the chair position—" "It's not," Lucas said firmly. "This is about your impact. You've already built something here. Maya, something important. We want to give you the platform to take it further." The other doctors nodded in agreement, and Maya felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in weeks. Recognition. "Think about it," Lucas said gently. "The hospital needs this, Maya, and it needs you." That night, as Maya sat in her apartment with a cup of tea, she thought about the day's events. Leading a formal mentorship initiative wasn't the same as being department chair. It didn't come with a title, a fancy office, or the prestige she had worked so hard for. But maybe, she thought, it was something better. The truth was, leadership wasn't about titles, it was about leaving something behind that mattered. And this program, this opportunity, felt like a chance to do just that. She could create a space where younger doctors, especially those who didn't fit the mold, could thrive. She could give them the tools and confidence they needed to succeed, to carry the work forward. Maya pulled Catherine's letter from her bag and read it again, her eyes lingering on the final line. "You made me feel seen when I felt invisible." Maybe that was her purpose. Not to fight for a seat at their table, but to build a new table altogether, one where everyone belonged. She placed the letter back in its envelope and whispered softly, "Keep going." And she knew she would. The next morning, Maya sent Lucas an email. "Let's talk about the mentorship initiative. I'm in." She hit send, feeling a quiet sense of triumph. The rejection still lingered, but it no longer defined her. Her impact would not be measured by a title on a door, but by the people she lifted along the way. And that, Maya realized, was the legacy she wanted to leave. It had been 2 weeks since Maya agreed to spearhead the mentorship initiative. The days had been filled with planning meetings, drafting program outlines, and carving time out of an already crowded schedule to ensure the initiative took root. Yet despite the long hours, Maya felt something she hadn't in weeks: purpose. Her office became a hub of quiet energy, the door often left open as residents filtered in and out. Sierra was practically a fixture there now, eager to contribute her ideas and help organize workshops. Lucas stopped by often, offering support and ensuring the hospital administration gave Maya the backing she needed. Word of the initiative began to spread. Residents talked about it in the break rooms, senior doctors began to take notice, and even some of the board members started asking questions. For the first time in a while, Maya felt visible not in the way she had once longed for, but in a way that mattered. Late one afternoon, Maya sat at her desk reviewing the program draft Sierra had typed up when there was a soft knock on her door. "Come in," she called without looking up. "Dr. Bennett?" a hesitant voice said. Maya glanced up to see Dr. Eliza Carroll, one of the senior doctors who had always kept her distance. Eliza was poised, with sharp features and an almost intimidating calmness about her. Maya couldn't remember the last time Eliza had spoken to her directly. "Dr. Carroll," Maya said, sitting straighter. "Please, come in." Eliza entered, clutching a manila folder tightly in her hands. She looked around briefly, her eyes lingering on the charts, the notes, and the faint hum of energy that seemed to pulse through Maya's office these days. "I wanted to talk to you about the mentorship initiative." Maya blinked, her guard instinctively going up. "Of course, what about it?" Eliza hesitated, as though choosing her words carefully. "I've been hearing a lot about what you're doing with the residents. It's impressive work." She paused, her expression softening slightly. "It's needed work." Maya's brow furrowed, surprised by the admission. Eliza had never been hostile toward her, but she also hadn't been supportive. Her silence in meetings often said more than her words. "I appreciate that," Maya replied carefully. "Thank you." Eliza shifted, looking uncomfortable. "Can I be honest with you?" she asked quietly. Maya nodded. "Please." Eliza exhaled, as though releasing a weight she'd been carrying. "When your name came up for department chair, I didn't advocate for you the way I should have. I didn't fight for you." She paused, avoiding Maya's gaze. "And I regret that." The words hit Maya like a punch she hadn't seen coming. For a moment, she could only stare at Eliza, stunned. "I don't have an excuse," Eliza continued. "I told myself it was easier to go along with what everyone else thought. But seeing what you're doing now, seeing the way these residents look up to you, the way you've turned rejection into something meaningful." She stopped herself, finally meeting Maya's eyes. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Maya sat back in her chair, her heart pounding. She had spent so long carrying the weight of that rejection, the pain of being overlooked, that she had stopped imagining a world where anyone might admit they were wrong. Eliza's words cracked something open in her, a mix of anger, relief, and an unexpected tenderness. "Thank you," Maya said finally, her voice steady. "That means more than you know." Eliza nodded, her face softening. "I'd like to help. With the mentorship program. If you'll let me." Maya studied her for a moment, searching for any trace of insincerity. She found none. Eliza's words were honest, raw in a way Maya hadn't expected. "Of course," Maya replied. "I'd be glad to have your help." A faint smile tugged at Eliza's lips. "Good." She turned to leave but paused at the door. "You're doing something important here, Maya. I'm glad someone finally sees it." As Eliza left, Maya sat quietly for a long moment, her thoughts swirling. She had spent so much time pushing against walls she thought would never crack. And now, here was someone, a peer, no less, admitting her mistakes and offering support. Maybe change wasn't always loud. Maybe it happened in moments like this, one person, one conversation at a time. That evening, Maya stayed late to finalize the first workshop schedule. Sierra sat across from her, a cup of coffee in hand and a look of pure determination on her face. "Do you think anyone will show up?" Sierra asked, glancing at the schedule Maya had just printed. "They'll show up," Maya replied confidently. If we build something worth showing up for, they'll come. Sierra nodded, as though absorbing Maya's conviction. I've been telling my friends about it. Some of the residents from other departments are excited. Good, Maya said. This isn't just for one group of people. It's for anyone who needs it. Sierra grinned. You're changing things here, Dr. Bennett. You know that, right? Maya looked at her for a long moment, her expression soft. Maybe, she admitted quietly, but I'm not doing it alone. Sierra's smile widened, and Maya felt a familiar warmth bloom in her chest. This was why she had agreed to lead the program, not for recognition, not to prove anything to the board, but because it mattered. The following morning, Maya stood at the front of a conference room packed with residents and young doctors. The room buzzed with anticipation, chairs squeezed together to accommodate the growing crowd. Maya glanced at Sierra, who sat proudly in the front row, and then at Eliza, who stood quietly at the back of the room, offering a small nod of encouragement. Good morning, everyone, Maya said, her voice clear and calm. The room fell silent. Thank you for coming. Today we begin something new. She paused, letting her words settle. This mentorship program was born out of a simple truth, that leadership isn't about titles or positions. It's about creating space for others to succeed. It's about lifting as we climb. The crowd listened intently, some nodding, others scribbling notes. For too long, many of us have felt invisible, Maya continued, but we're not. We're here. And the work we do matters no matter who sees it. She scanned the room, her voice softening. You belong here. Never let anyone convince you otherwise. The room erupted into applause, and Maya felt a wave of emotion rush through her. She caught Eliza's eye again, and this time, the older doctor smiled warmly. When the workshop ended, residents lingered to thank Maya, to ask questions, to share their excitement about what was to come. Sierra buzzed with energy, already brainstorming ideas for the next session. Maya stepped into the hallway where Lucas waited. You've done something special here, Maya, he said, his voice full of pride. You're building a legacy. Maya smiled faintly. One step at a time, Lucas chuckled. Sometimes that's all it takes. As Maya walked back to her office, she felt lighter than she had in months. The rejection hadn't disappeared, but its power over her had diminished. She had built something meaningful, not because of a title, but because of the people she had chosen to lift along the way. And as she looked down the bustling hallway, residents hurrying to their next shift, nurses calling out updates, patients moving through the space, she realized something profound. She didn't need the board's validation to make a difference. She already was. The hospital conference room sat quiet now, its chairs scattered, and coffee cups abandoned after the morning's workshop. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the empty tables. Maya stood alone at the podium, scanning the space where moments earlier she had been surrounded by residents, eager faces and voices filled with hope. The workshop had been a success more than she could have imagined. Doctors from different departments, backgrounds, and experience levels had gathered to learn and share their struggles. For the first time, Maya felt she had started something that could outlast her, something that didn't require validation from the board or anyone in power. It was hers, and it was theirs, the young doctors who saw her not just as a mentor, but as proof that the path they walked was possible. The afternoon carried on as usual. Rounds, chart reviews, patient updates. Maya moved through the day with quiet efficiency, but there was a new ease to her steps, as though the weight she had carried for so long had begun to lift. Just before her last meeting, Sierra appeared at her office door. A grin stretched across her face. She held a clipboard in her hands, waving it proudly. Dr. Bennett, look at this. Maya looked up, arching an eyebrow as Sierra entered. The sign-up sheet, Sierra explained, practically bouncing with excitement. For the mentorship program, over 30 residents have signed up already, some from other hospitals too. They heard about it through word of mouth. Maya's chest swelled with quiet pride as she took the clipboard and scanned the list. Names were scribbled across the page, some familiar, others new. "This is incredible, Sierra." Sierra beamed. "I told you people would show up. They're so inspired by what you're building here." Maya set the clipboard down and looked at her. "We're building it, Sierra. You're as much a part of this as I am." Sierra's smile faltered for a moment, replaced by something softer, something deeply grateful. "Thank you, Dr. Bennett, for everything." Maya nodded, her voice warm. "Keep showing up. That's what matters most." Later that evening, Maya found herself back in her office, catching up on paperwork as the hospital quieted for the night. The familiar hum of the overhead lights and distant echoes of footsteps brought her a sense of calm. She leaned back in her chair for a moment, staring out the window at the city skyline. Her phone buzzed on the desk, a message from Lucas. "Board meeting tomorrow at 8 a.m. They want an update on the mentorship program. Be ready to present." Maya frowned slightly, her mind hesitating at the thought of the board. Even now, the idea of standing before them, the same people who had deemed her not the right fit, brought a flicker of doubt. But she shook it off quickly. She wasn't the same woman she had been a month ago. She had seen what she could build, and no title could take that from her. She picked up her pen, jotting down notes and preparing for the meeting. The next morning, Maya walked into the boardroom with steady, confident steps. The room was as imposing as ever-long mahogany table, walls lined with framed portraits of past leaders, most of them men, all of them white. The board members sat waiting, their faces neutral but attentive as Maya entered. Lucas offered her a reassuring nod from the far end of the table. Eliza was there too, sitting off to the side, a quiet ally who had chosen finally to use her voice where it mattered. "Dr. Bennett," the hospital director greeted, his voice formal. "We're eager to hear about the mentorship initiative you've been leading." Maya stood tall, her hands steady as she unfolded her notes. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm and clear. "Over the past few weeks, we've seen significant interest in the program. More than 30 residents have signed up, and word is already spreading to other institutions. It's clear that mentorship and leadership development are areas where we, as an institution, can and must do better." She paused, scanning the faces around the table. Some nodded thoughtfully, others sat stone-faced. "It didn't matter," she continued. "This initiative isn't just about teaching skills. It's about creating a culture where everyone feels they belong, where leadership isn't reserved for those who fit an outdated mold, but is accessible to those willing to rise to the occasion. I've spent my career mentoring young doctors who often feel unseen or undervalued, and this program gives them the tools and confidence to succeed." The director shifted slightly in his chair, his expression unreadable. "And you believe this program can have a lasting impact?" "I don't just believe it," Maya said, her voice firm. "I've seen it." She thought of Sierra, of the young residents who now walked with their shoulders straighter, who no longer hesitated to ask questions or share ideas. She thought of Catherine Reynolds, the patient who had written to her after a decade, proof that her work had touched lives in ways she hadn't even realized. "This program isn't about me," Maya continued. "It's about the people we serve, our patients, our residents, our future leaders. It's about ensuring that this hospital truly reflects the community it serves. If we want to be better, we have to do better." The room was silent for a moment. Maya didn't look away, didn't shrink beneath their gaze. She had said what she needed to say. The director finally cleared his throat. "Thank you, Dr. Bennett. Your work has not gone unnoticed." Maya nodded. "Thank you for your time." She gathered her notes and left the room, her steps measured and steady. Lucas caught up with her in the hallway, a grin on his face. "You knocked it out of the park," he said. "Thank you, Lucas." "Change takes time, Maya," he said, his tone softer. "But you're moving the needle. They know it, even if they won't say it yet." Maya smiled faintly, one step at a time. That evening, Maya sat on her small balcony at home, a cup of tea in her hands. The city stretched out before her, lights twinkling like stars against the dark sky. She breathed in the cool air, feeling the quiet settle over her. Her phone buzzed on the table. A message from Sierra. "The residents loved today's session. We're making a difference, Dr. Bennett. Thank you for leading the way." Maya set the phone down and leaned back in her chair, her thoughts drifting. She thought of her mother's voice, words she hadn't heard in years. "Sometimes, you have to be the one to show them what's possible." Maya smiled softly, tears stinging her eyes. Her mother would be proud, not because of titles or recognition, but because Maya had chosen to keep going, to fight for something bigger than herself. She wasn't department chair. Maybe she never would be, but she had built something that mattered. She had shown others, Sierra, the residents, and even herself, that change was possible. In that quiet moment, as the wind rustled the leaves and the city hummed in the distance, Maya felt it fully. Peace, she whispered softly to the night, as though speaking to her younger self, her mother, and every person who had ever doubted her. "I am enough. I have always been enough." And she knew it to be true. The mentorship program became more than Maya could have imagined. In the weeks and months that followed, she watched young doctors thrive under its guidance. Residents who had once doubted themselves now spoke with confidence, their ideas heard and respected. They began to believe in their own potential because someone had shown them it was possible. Maya knew this was just the beginning. Change was slow, but it was happening one workshop, one conversation, one life at a time. She had chosen to rise above the bias, the rejection, and the doubts, building something meaningful in the face of it all. It wasn't the title that defined her, but the lives she had touched, the quiet victories, the small moments of hope that carried others forward. As Maya stood in front of her final workshop of the year, the room full of eager faces, she smiled. "Thank you all for showing up, not just today, but for yourselves," she said. "Leadership isn't about perfection. It's about showing up and lifting others as you climb. I hope you carry that forward in your careers, no matter where they take you. You are seen, you are valued, and you belong." The applause was heartfelt, residents standing to thank her, some even lining up afterward to shake her hand. As Sierra approached, beaming with pride, Maya felt it again, peace. She had created something lasting, something that mattered. If you followed Maya's journey, thank you for being here. Her story reminds us all that resilience, kindness, and hope can build legacies far greater than any title. If this story inspired you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of perseverance and growth. Join our community and help spread messages of strength, empathy, and change one story at a time. Together, we can create a ripple effect. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.